福尔摩斯探案。教父俄利根认为耶稣的服事时间是1年多，但是持3年半理论的人通常引述俄利根作为最古老的资料来讲说耶稣的服事时间是3年半，依据是他对但以理书的评述。相比之下，凯撒利亚的优西比乌作为拥有3年半理论的第一人，则是毫无争议的事实。身为俄利根的隔代门生，优西比乌将俄利根对但以理书之7为70年的解释改为7年。他因此提出了耶稣在复活前服事3年半，复活后又与门徒一起相处3年半这样令人啼笑皆非的观点。这种以寓意解经的角度，先验性解读约翰福音文本的方式，让约翰福音5章和6章分别多出了一次逾越节，是缺失证据支撑的。为了获得更具有说服力的证据，尼西米团队将研究方向转向最艰难，也是最有价值的圣经古文本研究。尼西米试图以文本鉴别的科学严谨性来探究约翰福音6章4节是否属于圣经。这几乎带我们进入了一个看似眼花缭乱却层层递进展开的圣经手稿的迷宫。若非具有福尔摩斯探案的精神，真的难以发现这里的真相是什么。仅就在472号手稿里是否包含约翰福音6章4节，其论述的深度已为我们开启了一个全新的圣经古文本认知领域。本集重点讲述了新约圣经格雷斯版里的一处相关评注，其中文本变体、手稿查询编号、德文著作 Text and Text Work 和兰贝斯公手稿等，是我们理解的着陆点。
Nehemiah, I think this is the time that maybe not everyone knows what is important about 1776 and this silver round that you had minted, 1 troy ounce of pure silver. Yep. And what does 1776 have to do with this?
So we have been searching now for over 2 years for manuscripts with the full vowels. Up until about 2 years ago, I had 5 manuscripts that had the full vowels of the name Yehovah. Most manuscripts, one of the vowels missing, but I had 5 where the full vowels Yehovah are in there. Really the doors broke open when they started digitizing manuscripts, and within about a year, we had 1,000 manuscripts. I did the announcement with Michael Rood, 1,000 manuscripts with a full vowel. As of today, as of this recording, we have 1,776 manuscripts with the full vowel. Yes. The team has been hard at work. T-Bone has been cranking out more and more manuscripts. He actually went through a section of something like 300 manuscripts, and only 2 or 3 of them had the full vowels. So, you know, you might expect the first year we got 1,000, the second year we'd get another 1,000, but no, sometimes that's not how it goes, right? You go through manuscript after manuscript and you don't find the name with full vowels, and then all of a sudden you do, so we're up to 1776. It also so happens that silver round there was minted by the King of Denmark in the 1640s, and it has Yehovah's name on it. The original was, that is, it's based on this Danish coin from the 1640s that was used in Denmark, and this was the emblem of the King of Denmark, of Christian IV of Denmark. The name Yehovah with the phrase Justus Judex, which means righteous judge. It's a phrase from the Bible. And this was actually a fulfillment of a prophecy of Malachi. Malachi chapter 1, verse 11, he says, "My name is great among the nations. From the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, my name is great among the nations." And when people heard this in the 5th century, around the year 400 BC, from the mouth of Malachi, I can't imagine that they understood that as far away as Denmark and Iceland and all the way across an ocean they didn't even know existed about, God's name, Yehovah, would be glorified. So I look at that Danish coin from the 1640s as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That's why I had a replica minted with the front, and on the back put the verse from Malachi. It's an amazing witnessing tool. I hear from people now all over the world who travel around and meet people, and they show them this replica, this silver round, showing them how one of Malachi's prophecies was fulfilled 2,000 years after the prophet spoke his words in Denmark. It was actually all over Europe as well. Now, when the United States was founded, there was no official currency. And the standard currency they used was called the Spanish piece of 8. And then they wanted to say what other coins would be accepted by the U.S. Treasury. So Thomas Jefferson was commissioned to put out a report and assay all the coins. And one of the coins he explicitly mentions is the ducat of Denmark. This coin with Jehovah's name on it was one of the few coins that was accepted as official currency when the United States was founded, and this was in 1776.
1776.
Yep.
So I stepped outside of my authority and I asked T-Bone, please don't look for any more until after Passover next month, the real Passover. I'll tell you, this is great. You know, when we talk about manuscripts, you know, we have found no ancient Greek manuscripts that say that Jesus didn't heal a man who was lame for 38 years, or that Yeshua didn't heal a man who was born blind. You know, we're dealing with minutia, but this minutia is whether the scriptures fit together or not. Whether we can get back to that word which holy men of God wrote as they were moved by the Holy Spirit, or if we are just going to be subject to interpolations that have been passed down to us, and insertions that have been passed down. And that is what I think is so valuable about what these two gentlemen have done. There is no way that I could repay them for what they've done in backing up what I knew to be real. And Nehemiah traveled with me for 45 cities as I gave my rendition of what the original Hebrew Matthew must have said, that Joseph was the father of Miriam, not only Joseph, the son of Eli, the husband of Miriam, as it is in Luke, but that Yosef was the father. Yosef ben Yaakov was the father of Miriam. And he listened to me night after night, 45 cities, and then a couple years later at Yom Teruah, he brought me the manuscript, the picture, the photograph of the manuscript, the two oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew that include the correct genealogy of Yeshua through Yaakov, Yosef ben Yaakov, the father of Miriam, of whom was born Yeshua, making Yeshua the 14th generation from the carrying away to Babylon unto the Messiah, just as it says even in the Greek. But the Greek only has 13 generations. The Hebrew that Nehemiah found has 14 generations in it, and this is something that I get to teach all the time because this was the $10,000 question that the rabbis presented to me over 20 years ago. And so now these gentlemen are going to take us on the rest of this journey as we are in now the Gospel of John.
That's right. So, I just want to kind of reiterate what Michael said. It's a really important point. We're looking at John 6:4, and we found out that in the 2nd century AD, there were some manuscripts that did not have John 6:4, and the proof of that is these church fathers. We saw it in Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Origen, and there's others that we couldn't even get to. And this was been recognized for hundreds of years by Christian scholars, right? This is something that's been discussed and debated and recognized. 1643 is our earliest reference to the debate. But there is no manuscript anywhere of the New Testament where there's a textual variant where it says Jesus is not the Messiah. That manuscript doesn't exist. There is no manuscript of the New Testament where it says that Yeshua did not rise on the 3rd day. That manuscript doesn't exist, right? So what we are really talking about are some of these details, and the same could be said of the Tanakh. There are Tanakh manuscripts, for example, where instead of Yehovah, it says Adonai, or Adonai, it says Yehovah. We'll see an example perhaps later. But we don't have any manuscripts of the Tanakh where it says that Moses didn't write the Torah, All right, every single manuscript agrees that Moses wrote the Torah and that God appeared to the Israelites, 600,000 men and many other women and children at Mount Sinai and spoke directly to them. Every single manuscript of the Bible that exists preserves that record. And so what we're really talking about here are some of the finer details, and those details can be important to people because if you want to understand the chronology, then Michael has presented a possibility. And really my question from the very beginning is, could Michael be right? I don't need to prove if he's right. That comes from what I call the explanatory scope. He can explain all these details and all this information about the Gospels, which otherwise seem like random events, which have, it's kind of jumbled. And look, people have been doing this for centuries. In the 2nd century, there's a man named Tatian who took the 4 Gospels and tried to put them in a chronological order. And so this is something Christian scholars have been doing for many, many centuries. Michael has attempted to do it. John 6:4 did not fit into his model. And now we're looking at the evidence for whether that is supported or not. Now, we talked about Origen, who was the 2nd century church father, lived at the end of the 2nd century. And he talks about the ministry of Yeshua being 1 year. And then he says other statements which make it clear he does not have John 6:4 in his gospel at that time. Now, at the end of Origen's life, it is argued by those who support the 3.5-year ministry, such as George Ogg. We mentioned his book before. It's a really good book. You should get it on Amazon.com. And Ogg argues that Origen not only had the 1-year ministry early in his life, but later in his life, he actually advocated for a longer ministry. In fact, a 3.5 or 3 years, possibly even a 3-year ministry.
He doesn't actually detail the length of the ministry.
Well,
but
he makes nearly 3 years.
So the proponents of a 3.5-year ministry will cite Origen as the oldest source for 3.5 years.
And they'll say about 3 years.
Which is important because even they acknowledge that it's hard to find sources older than that. There's Melito of Sardis as a source that's cited, but it's disputed. So even for a proponent of the 3.5-year ministry, Origen is often cited as the oldest source, and it comes from some statements he made about Daniel,
which we'll get to in a minute, but
where they deduce he's got a chronology longer. Right. He never refuted what he said originally, and the statements that he does say that you can deduce he may have extended the ministry of Yeshua, none of them were based on anything to do with counting Passovers. There's no reason to think that his text had changed. It was an allegorical interpretation of Daniel.
Ah. Right. Now, for example, we mentioned Tatian, who was this church father in the 2nd century. He wrote this book called the Diatessaron, where he took all 4 Gospels and put them what he thought was chronological order, and he includes John 6:4. However, we only have the Arabic translation of Tatian's Diatessaron. We don't have that passage in the original, as far as I was able to find, at least. And the point is, every time we have one of these 2nd century sources, these are always disputed sources. Perhaps the only exception is P66 and P75 that we'll get to. But let's start with Origen. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Michael, can you read that? Because Origen's commenting on that.
And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspread of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate.
Now, Origen, in his allegorical commentary on Daniel, took this to be a 70-year period. That 7 or that week, he somehow took to be a 70-year period. And he said that 70-year period is punctuated in the middle with the death of Christ. That is, the first 35 years were from the advent of Jesus all the way up into his death. And then the second 75 years was from the resurrection until the destruction of the temple in the year 70. So because of that, he needs the death of Yeshua to be approximately the year 35, or if he thought the temple was destroyed in 68, that's not clear either, then 2 years earlier, then 33. Unfortunately, we were not able to get a hold of what Origen actually wrote. This has survived, as far as we can tell, in Latin, and we were not able to get a hold of the Latin text. We didn't get it. I mean, we did the best we could. We were dealing with these databases, and look, this is an ongoing project, people. We actually are going to continue this study after this teaching. John's goal is to look at every single manuscript that exists and to see if it has John 6:4 or not. And he actually wants you to contact him. He has an email which he got, which is john64@gmail.com. But it's the number 6. Everything else is spelled out. And he's going to continue this project. I'm going to help him as well. We're going to continue, and we're going to find out how many manuscripts actually really have John 6:4 and how many don't. We're going to show you what we know today. Everything we're saying is just based on what we know today, and that could change.
And beyond the Greek, the Old Latin, there's other languages that have preserved the manuscripts, not just the Greek manuscripts.
We might find out there's all kinds of languages where John 6:4 is missing. We already know of one, but we're not going to share that today. We don't have time to get to that. So Origen on Daniel 9:27 has this allegorical interpretation which breaks up the 7 into 70 years, which is 35 and 35. And it's inferred from that, to the best that we can tell, that he takes Yeshua's ministry to be about 3 years. And there's a second statement where he also seems to indicate that later in his life. These were books that were written towards the end of Origen's life. And so he may be the first one who has a ministry that's about 3 years. And he's already in the 2nd century. So that is not 100% clear, but it does seem from what we've seen, that seems to be the case. The first one we know for sure that has a 3.5-year ministry, indisputably, is Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived from 260 to 340 approximately. Eusebius is famous from the Council of Nicaea in 325, where he was one of the main spokesmen. And he was also the court historian of Constantine. Tell us a little bit about Eusebius.
Well, I think Eusebius is the one figure that we know most about. He was a student of Pamphilus, and Pamphilus was a student of Origen. So he's a disciple of Origen's disciple. And as relates to this allegorical interpretation of Daniel that Eusebius comments on, there's a relationship between what he says and what Origen said. It's important to note that Pamphilus, he wrote an apology for Origen after Origen died. Eusebius actually had to finish Pamphilus's apology for Origen because Pamphilus was killed as well. So he had to write the last book of the apology for Origen. In Pamphilus's apology for Origen, he quotes the same thing that Origen wrote in First Principles about the 1-year ministry. So Origen, even though he had this allegorical interpretation, his disciples still took away the idea of a 1-year ministry and continued to write on the 1-year ministry and even defended it in their works.
And remember, if there's a 1-year ministry, you can't have John 6:4 in the gospel.
So Eusebius, his interpretation, and Nehemiah is going to show the slide, but his interpretation is connected to Origen's interpretation. Origen looked at the week of Daniel, and he wanted to fill that week out with years in between the advent of Yeshua and the destruction of the temple. He wanted 35 and 35. He wanted to split the week, and Eusebius does something similar to what Origen does.
Now, before we get to Eusebius's explanation of the length of the full 3.5 years, let's see how he explains John. Because we already brought a quote from Eusebius, which says that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were 1 year. So how could John be 3.5? The Gospel of John be 3.5 years? So here's what he says. This is Eusebius. The 3 Gospels already mentioned having come into the hands of all and into John's 2. So that's really interesting. Eusebius is writing this book called The Church History. He's the first one really to do this. And a lot of what we know about the early period of the church comes from Eusebius. Now that's a good thing, but there's also a danger in there because Eusebius chose only to share what he thought was appropriate to share. There are all kinds of things Eusebius didn't tell you about because he either didn't think they were relevant or he thought they were maybe even from his perspective heretical. Like where are all these Jewish believers in Yeshua who are keeping the Torah? Eusebius doesn't tell you a whole lot about that. He tells you about Papias. I've talked in my teaching the Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. I quote Papias. What I'm really quoting is Eusebius quoting Papias. A lot of these books were destroyed, and our only remnant of them comes from Eusebius' church history. So it's a very important book for understanding the first 3 centuries after Yeshua. He says the 3 Gospels already mentioned having come into the hands of all and into John's 2. So according to Eusebius' information, John read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's incredible because the way it's presented in secular scholarship is Luke was written for one church and Matthew was written for another, and a third church had John, and the people who read John didn't know about Luke. That's not how Eusebius presents it. They say that John accepted them and bore witness to their truthfulness. but that there was lacking in them an account of the deeds done by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. So in other words, there was a part of the ministry that John had to fill in the blanks, and everything that's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but is in John, let's say other than the last few days, right? That's obviously at the end. Everything else is before Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He goes on, John accordingly in his gospel records the deeds of Christ, which were performed before John the Baptist was cast into prison. But the other three evangelists mention the events which happened after that time. This is according to Eusebius. Now, we're not saying we agree with this, but it shows you in a sense how forced Eusebius' position is. He's got to fit every event in John that's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke into before the one-year ministry which he acknowledges. Now, the whole period of our Savior's teaching and working of miracles is said to have been 3.5 years, which is half a week. So where is he getting the half a week? John 9:27. So his teacher's teacher, as well as his teacher, took John 9:27 allegorically, meaning Origen took that allegorically as 70 years. He says, no, a week is 7 years, not 70 years. And half of that week is the teaching of Yeshua on earth before the crucifixion. And he says, John the evangelist in his gospel makes this clear to the attentive. And that's really important. We got to stop there for a minute. When Eusebius says John the evangelist in his gospel makes this clear that ministry is 3.5 years, he means, look, I'm interpreting this allegorically, but I can find it in John even without the allegory. So where is Eusebius finding this? Where is he getting 3.5 years from the Gospel of John? Doesn't say Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He agrees that's 1 year. Where does he get it from the Gospel of John? Well, the first and the last Passover we all know about, John 2 and John 12. We've talked about that. John 5, he evidently took to be, the unnamed feast, he took to be a Passover, and he must have had John 6:4 as a Passover. That's what he's referring to when he says John makes this clear to the attentive, right? It's not explicit, but you can turn John 5, the unnamed feast, into a Passover, and then you get 3 years and change. That's where he's getting it from. Okay, is that clear? Mm-hmm. Everybody's agreeing on this? All right. Goes on. This is Eusebius. 1 week of years, therefore, would be represented by the whole period of his association with the apostles, both the time before his passion, meaning the crucifixion, and the time after his resurrection. Did you hear what he just said? Let's finish. For it is written that before his passion, he showed himself for the space of 3.5 years. Where is that written? In John, if you take John 5, the unnamed feast to be a Passover, and John 6:4 is another Passover, then you get 3 years and change. That's what he means, for it is written. Let's see. The space of 3.5 years to his disciples and also those who were not his disciples. But after his resurrection, he was most likely with his disciples a period equal to the years, being seen of them 40 days and eating with them and speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God, as the Acts of the Apostles tell us. So according to Eusebius, Yeshua was 3.5 years before the crucifixion, and then 3.5 years after the resurrection.
7, yeah, there's your.
Someone in the audience said, what?
Yeah. That's where you got a 3.5. That's where you got a 3.5 year ministry. You got to accept the 7 years too.
So the origin of the or I shouldn't say the origin, because he is connecting it to John by reading John 5 and John 6 as Passovers, but his model of the ministry is that this is based on Daniel 9:27, that 1 week. Yeshua is cut off in the middle of the week, and then there's another 3.5 years after the resurrection, not really mentioned in the New Testament, right? Because we've got the 40 days, right? And we have various scenes, but 3.5 years?
Hanging out.
What was he doing?
Eusebius, he's coming from an allegorical perspective, and he's looking at the text of John. He doesn't come from the text of John and say, well, we've got these Passovers, it has to be 3.5 years.
Right.
He's looking for 3.5 years. And when he opens up John and looks, and there's no question, his text has to have John 6:4.
Right.
That's
no
not
question
disputed by anybody.
The proof, by the way, that he's reading it into the text is John 5 says nothing about Passover.
What he's doing is he sees an unnamed feast, and he says, hey, I just make this Passover. I have the 3.5 years that I'm looking for.
Exactly. So look, in Jewish history, they talk about, there's this great rabbi, Ibn Ezra, and he talks about different ways of reading the Bible. And he says the goal is that you fire the arrow and you hit the target. But he says there's some people who don't do that. What they do is they fire the arrow, and then they walk over to the plaque and they draw the target around it. I think that's what Eusebius is doing here, at least in John 5, right? At least in John 5, where he takes an unknown feast, and the earlier authors are saying, wait, this is a really cramped period of time. Like there's really 6 months or a year between like, the end of chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 5. Like really, is that much time? It doesn't sound like that. But that's how he reads it, because he wants to get to the 7 years of Daniel 9:27 and see this as a model of the ministry of Yeshua. Okay, so what we've seen up until now, everything we've seen are church fathers. What I want to do right now is bring you the manuscripts. And here's why the manuscripts are important. In textual studies, we have a distinction between what's called an emendation. An emendation is I read the text and I say something's wrong and I change it. And that's one thing. And a textual variant. A textual variant means I'm not just changing the text, I actually have a manuscript. And Michael, you gave the example of Matthew chapter 1, where it talks about Joseph, the husband of Miriam, and you had suggested for years, other people had suggested as well, I think Lamza might have been the first to suggest it, that the word guvra there means husband, but maybe it also has the sense of the strong one, the father. That was a way of kind of interpreting. It seemed a bit forced to me. And what you were really suggesting is originally this said husband. That was an emendation.
Or no, father.
Father. Originally
father.
That it said father, that was an emendation. It was conjecture. We didn't have that text. And then I found 2 manuscripts. They were very late manuscripts, but they both read Joseph, the father of Miriam.
That was the Hebrew Matthew.
That was in Hebrew Matthew. 2 late manuscripts, Hebrew Matthew have Joseph, the father of Miriam. And if you want to say it says Joseph, the husband of Miriam, and be left with Matthew and Luke contradict each other, you can do that. That's fine.
And only 13 generations. No more.
It doesn't really fit that way. But if you look at this variant, everything falls into place. Is that just a coincidence? In this case, I don't think so, but you have to decide for yourself. In the case of John 6:4, the difference between having manuscripts or not is the difference between, is this just conjecture, or did something somewhere in the history of all these thousands of manuscripts survive? And the answer is, we do have something that survived. Now, we have 9 key manuscripts that we're going to show you. I believe there are more, but we don't have that more yet. We will look for the more, and you can contact john64@gmail.com. But for now, we're going to show you what we have today. These manuscripts range in dates from the 11th to the 15th century. So before we get to the manuscripts, I want to start with what's called the critical edition. The critical edition is hundreds of scholars around the world combed through manuscripts for centuries, and the results of their work have been compiled in a printed Bible called the Nestle Aland edition. This, what I have here up on the screen, is NA 26, the 26th edition of Nestle Aland. And on John chapter 6, verse 4, there's a little square, and the square means that something is omitted or missing. Missing is kind of a loaded term because it implies it's supposed to be there. So the more neutral term is omitted. And what is omitted? The entire verse, and it's omitted in manuscript 472. What is 472? Every Greek New Testament manuscript is given a Gregory Aland number, and based on that, you can then find out a much longer name, what library it's in, we'll tell you in a few minutes. And then it says PC. PC in the New Testament, this is called a critical apparatus. Every little symbol here has significance and meaning, right? It tells you that something is missing or added or changed or different, very slightly different words. And this is actually kind of a big deal here. It's the whole verse is missing in manuscript 472, and PC is not politically correct. It stands for the Latin pauci, which means several. So it's 472 plus several other manuscripts in which verse 4 of John 6 is missing. What are those several? Don't know. How do you find it? Not easy. So, Michael, you had seen the Nestle Aland 26 or 27?
Right. Nestle Aland 26 is the work that I was working from. And so when I saw that it was missing from that, then that's what I put in the forward of my book.
Okay.
That 472, that those words are missing. And I could not get a photograph of this, and so I eventually went over to Lambeth Palace.
I want you to save that story for when we look at 472.
Okay.
It's really exciting.
Okay. But it was 26. This is what I was looking at and didn't...
So according to Nestle Allen 26, it's manuscript 472, as well as several other manuscripts where it's missing. And the next one we have is Nestle Allen 27. Same exact story. It's omitted or missing from 472, the entire 1 John 6:4. But that is only up until the year 2004, the 8th corrected printing. And guys, to find this out, I was going to libraries all over the place, asking them, do you have a Nestle Allen 27? Oh, we've got a bunch of them. And I'm pulling them up, and I'm like, no, I need the specific one from 2004 and 2005 and 2006. They're like, well, we don't know which edition we have. It's all the same. It's Nestle Allen 27. No, it's not all the same. Because in 2006, that's a 2004 edition, the 8th corrected printing. In 2006, they changed it. In the 9th corrected printing, and they went over from saying the verse is missing in 472 and several to 1634 and several, and 1634 is a different manuscript. Which one is it? We'll see in a few minutes. Now, one of my questions when I was doing this research was, what happened between 2004 and 2006?
Well, this whole this change is confusing, and this is a problem. I'm having discussions, and I go to buy the book, and it's not in there at all. And a friend of mine says, "Don't you see? They corrected it. It was a mistake."
Because in Nestle Allen 28, it doesn't have this note at all. It says nothing about John 6:4.
There's nothing there. And
if you looked at Nestle Allen 25 or 28, or 1 through 25, right, you would not know there was any issue with John 6:4. You just think, yeah, that's in there. No question about it.
So I'm arguing with my friend, and he says, why don't you email the editors and find out for sure? So we did. We emailed the editors.
So we emailed the editors of the Nestle Allen 28, and we asked them what happened between 2004 and 2006, and why in 2010 is it not in the Nestle Allen 28 edition? And what they told us is, look, we have limited space. So look what you have up here. You have all these different notes, and each note is full of meaning. They said, we can't put everything up there. We have limited space. So we have to make a choice of what we think is important based on the evidence available to us. And in 26 and 27, somebody thought it was important. By 28, they said, it's not that important. We can leave that information out. You guys don't need to know about that. Now, what happened between the 2004 and 2006 is they came out with a book called Text und Textwerk. It's a book in German. And
you had to take 2 years of German to be able to figure this out.
Well, I took 2 years of German at Hebrew University, but this I actually didn't need much German for. It's mostly just textual notations. And what you can see up here in this 2005 book, what they did is they went through not every verse in John, but they chose select verses in John that they wanted to check, and they checked those in every manuscript available to them at the University of Munster, where they have a large collection of microfilms of manuscripts. And so for example, they took John 6:4 and they looked at it in over 1,000 manuscripts. And they determined that John 6:4 does appear in numerous manuscripts. In fact, they list for you up here 162 manuscripts that have John 6:4, where it's not omitted. And those 162 include some very prominent and important manuscripts. They include P66 and P75. Scholars argue that those two manuscripts date from the 2nd century. So they actually predate Eusebius, if that dating is correct. There's one scholar named Nongbre who's written these articles claiming that those manuscripts are later. But look, guys, that's beyond my expertise. If we accept the date of P66 and P75, then John 6:4 appears already in the 2nd century. And what that means is, alongside Origen reading his Gospel of John, where there is no John 6:4, somewhere else in the Roman Empire, there's somebody reading a different manuscript which has John 6:4. And that's entirely possible. Origen only had access to what he had access to. right?
But he did have access to a lot of manuscripts.
He sure had access to a lot of stuff.
And we can't say that Origen didn't see manuscripts that had John 6:4. But if he did, he didn't consider them important.
He didn't consider them reliable.
And he
right?
was a textual critic. This was
Yeah.
his job, and he was schooled by the best.
In other words, Origen may have had 100 manuscripts in his library, and he saw that 10 of them had John 6:4, and he said, oh, that was added. Right? We don't know. We don't know. All we know is what we have evidence for. And what we have evidence for is that he must have had a manuscript that did not have John 6:4. So going back to text and textwork, we see some very important manuscripts listed up here. And we see 1, 01, 02, 03, 05. That's Vaticanus, Sinaiticus. I mean, these are important manuscripts of the New Testament. 05, I believe, is Bezai, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Very important manuscripts. 162 of them. Interestingly, one of those listed that contains John 6:4 is 472. So does 472 have John 6:4 or doesn't it have John 6:4? We'll find out soon. We'll come back to that. At the end of the 162 manuscript, it says BYZ, which means Byzantine, and that means the Byzantine majority text. And what they mean is there's a bunch of other manuscripts that have John 6:4, but we can't list everything because life's short and we have a limited amount of space on the page. And already this is a $600 book, and if we made it longer, it would be it literally is like a $500-600 book. Thankfully, it was on Google Books and we could get this page.
That's just the John version. There's
That's
Matthew
just the Gospel of John.
and select verses.
And they didn't even check every verse, and it's a $500-600 book. Okay, so it says BYZ 1653. That means there's 1,653 manuscripts that have John 6:4, but they only listed for you 162 of them. 1,491, just take our word for it. Now, I could already tell you they're wrong about what they said about 472. As we'll see, it's a bit complicated, but they're wrong. Then they list other information here on the page. One of the things they say is they list 3 manuscripts in which John 6:4 is not in the text. In one of those, it's in the margin, we'll see in a minute, and the other 2 is just not there at all. Now, why did they list 3 manuscripts? Because that's what they knew about. There's actually 4 manuscripts where it's not in there. Why didn't they list the 4th? Well, the 4th one is included in their list of Byzantine manuscripts, so they actually made a mistake. So far I found 2 mistakes on the page. And I didn't even check more than a few hundred, well, John checked a few hundred manuscripts. If we checked all 1,653, I bet we'd find more than 2 mistakes. Going on, they then say verse 4, cum asteriskis vel obelis. We'll get to what that means. They list 6 manuscripts with asterisk and obelisk. We're going to wait for that, okay? One of the sources we looked at was a guy named von Soden who wrote in 1907, and he has a critical apparatus of his own. So he's coming long before Nestle Aland, and he's saying, I'm going through every verse, looking at many manuscripts, and he lists 2 manuscripts that omit John 6:4. Guys, these things are very difficult to read and decipher. For me to find out what he meant by I-1386 took basically like a whole day, right? And that's one detail to find out. It's not simple at all. And then he has K iota 20 as the second manuscript where John 6:4 is omitted. What does he mean by that? So I-1386 refers to the 472, which is the Lambeth Palace manuscript. Michael will tell you about that in a few minutes. The Lambeth Palace manuscript, the verse is omitted, and also manuscript 850, which is in the Vatican, Barb Greek 504. We'll see that in a little bit. So let me summarize everything going on here. John 6:4, when it comes to the manuscript 472, okay? 472 is Lambeth Palace. Von Soden says it's omitted, and the reason I'm talking about this is Michael in his chronological Gospels is relying on Nestle Aland 26. When he published that, there was really no way to find out what was in 472 other than rely on these sources or go to Lambeth Palace. How'd that work out? Not too well.
Yeah, I went to Lambeth Palace because I'm getting ready for the Spanish version, the Chinese and all that. And so I wanted to get a photograph of this because what I have up to this point is I know it's not in there because Nestle tells me it's not in there.
Yeah.
And so then I do the transcript, I do it in Greek characters, and I put it in there, and I just leave out John 6:4, and I say that's the way it is in Lambeth Palace. So I want to go over there and get the photograph of it. I arrive at the Archbishop of Canterbury's place, Lambeth Palace, and I meet with the secretary who lived at a kibbutz in Israel for a number of years. So we hit it off real big. Yeah. But the Archbishop is not in, and this is the Armistice Day. This is the day that the war was won. Everyone's wearing poppies, and it's like everything is shut down. And I'll tell you, if I was able to get in there and take a photograph of this, and that my heart would have sank, because 472 does say, and Passover, the feast of the Jews, is nigh. And how it arrives there, I would not be able to figure out, because this is way over my pay grade, as is everything that these guys are doing here, way over my pay grade. I'm just simply trying to put the chronological gospels together using the evidence, but they have found the evidence. And so what happened with Lambeth Palace Museum?
Just to explain, guys, this is no trivial matter to find out answers to these things. To have access to the databases we need, you could buy a new car with what it cost to, and I'm not exaggerating, to a nice car too, to get access to these databases. Now, this is an overview of what happened here. Before we get to 472 itself, we have over here, Von Soden says it's omitted, Nestle Allen 26 says it's omitted, Nestle Allen 27 version 8 says it's omitted, TNT says no, they've got it in there. It's in there. It's included without any marks or anything. Nestle Allen 27.9 doesn't even mention 472, it mentions 1634, and Nestle Allen 28 doesn't mention John 6:4 at all. So let's see what actually is in Lambeth Palace, okay? So you can see up there, Lambeth Palace is a place in England, in London, and it has manuscript 1177 dated to the 11th or 12th century, and minuscule 472. Minuscule means it's written in small characters versus the earlier manuscripts written in capital letters. And you can see there the word to Pascha, the Passover. So John 6:4 is in there after all. However, in the margin, we have this little guy there, that little star-shaped symbol called an obelisk. And this is mentioned by Text und Textwerk, known as TNT, that book from 2005, the German book. They mention that there's 6 manuscripts with an obelisk or an asterisk. Well, what is an obelisk or an asterisk? This is a famous French cartoon. And the French cartoon is actually a pun. The pun is that in Latin and Greek manuscripts, when they have something in the manuscript which is considered doubtful, it is marked with an asterisk or an obelisk. Those are scribal notation symbols. And the author of this cartoon, the cartoon is about these two people in Gaul who are fighting the Romans, named Asterisk and Obelisk. And Obelisk is the big, cute guy. So the whole cartoon is, and when I was a little kid, I used to read the Sunday comics, and they would read the cartoon, Asterisk and Obelisk. And so Asterisk and Obelisk are this pun. And these symbols go back to textual criticism of Greek texts in Alexandria. We mentioned before Origen, and how even before the time of Origen, the Greeks said, hey, we consider the book of Homer to be sacred, but we have differences in our manuscripts. And so they would mark those differences, the ones they thought to be doubtful, with these symbols. Now, Origen mentions these, and he writes as follows. Origen says, and remember, this is part of his hexapla. The hexapla is he was systematically comparing the Hebrew Tanakh with the Greek translation called the Septuagint. And he says, we marked with an obelus, obelus is the Greek word for obelisk, we marked with an obelus those passages not found in the Hebrew. And we added other passages with an asterisk in order that it might be clear that we have added passages not found in the Septuagint. So when he saw something in Hebrew, which wasn't in the Greek, he put it into the Greek, but he said, I don't know if this is supposed to be here, and he marked it with an asterisk. And when he found stuff in the Greek that wasn't in the Hebrew, he marked it with the obelisk. He who so wishes may accept these things, But to one whom this matter causes offense, he may do what he wishes concerning the acceptance or not. So he's telling you, I don't consider these to be trustworthy, or in some cases, I'm not sure if they're trustworthy. You decide for yourself.